The realtor handed me 3 sets of keys, each one catching the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was now my home. Not our home. Not the place I'd eventually have to leave. Mine. The weight of those keys felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried, and lighter than any freedom I'd ever known. As I stood in the marble foyer of my dream house, I couldn't help but think about the last words Marcus had said to me 18 months ago. "You'll be back, Jessica." But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You always come back. You can't survive without me. He'd been so certain, so smug, standing in the doorway of the apartment I was fleeing with nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart full of determination he'd spent years trying to crush. Marcus never saw these keys. He never saw the steel in my spine that his cruelty had forged. He never saw the empire I built from the ashes of everything he told me I'd never be. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman with a story like this. Growing up in small-town Nebraska, I was Jessica Marie Thompson, the girl who helped her mother run the local flower shop and dreamed of something bigger but never quite believed she deserved it. I was the one who said please and thank you to everyone, who apologized when other people bumped into me, who made herself smaller so others could feel bigger. My mother used to say I had too much heart for my own good, always putting others first, always assuming the best in people even when they showed me their worst. When I met Marcus Williams at 23, fresh out of college with a business degree I wasn't sure how to use, he seemed like everything I thought I wanted. He was older, confident, successful, with this way of taking up space that made me feel safe and protected. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a BMW, and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. When he walked into Petals and Posies that humid August afternoon, looking for flowers for his mother's birthday, I thought he was the most sophisticated man I'd ever met. Marcus had this laugh that filled rooms, and this way of making you feel like you were the only person who mattered when he focused his attention on you. He was charming in that effortless way that some people are born with, the kind of charm that makes waitresses smile brighter and strangers offer unsolicited help. He noticed things about me that no one else ever had. How I arranged flowers with an artist's eye, how I remembered every customer's favorite combination, how I could calm even the most stressed bride with just the right words. Those early months felt like living in a romantic comedy. Marcus would show up at the shop with coffee from the expensive place downtown, the kind with foam art that I'd only seen on social media. He'd take me to restaurants where I felt underdressed even in my best outfit, where the menus had no prices and the servers knew wine pairings I'd never heard of. He introduced me to museums and theater performances, to a world that felt glossy and important, and so far removed from my simple life that I sometimes felt like I was playing dress-up. Marcus was generous in those days, almost overwhelming in his attention. He'd surprise me with jewelry I felt too plain to wear, with weekend trips to cities I'd only read about. When I protested that it was too much, that I couldn't accept such expensive gifts, he'd laugh and tell me I deserved beautiful things. He made me feel special, chosen, like I'd won some cosmic lottery by catching his interest. My mother was thrilled. Finally, she'd say, Jessica found herself a good man who can take care of her. Even my practical father, who distrusted charm on principle, seemed impressed by Marcus's success and apparent devotion to his daughter. The proposal came 6 months later, on a snowy December evening in the shop after I'd closed for the day. Marcus had filled the entire space with white roses, hundreds of them, their perfume almost overwhelming in the enclosed space. He got down on one knee between the displays I'd arranged earlier, holding a ring that caught the overhead lights and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. Jessica Marie Thompson, he said, his voice steady and sure, you've shown me what love really means. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me? I said yes because I thought I loved him, because everyone expected me to, because the alternative was staying in my small world forever, while he moved on to someone more worthy of his attention. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that felt foreign on my hand for weeks. Planning the wedding felt like being swept along by a current I couldn't control. Marcus had opinions about everything, from the venue to the flowers to the guest list. He knew exactly what he wanted, and what he wanted always seemed reasonable, always seemed right. When I suggested using flowers from local growers to support the community, he gently explained that we needed sophistication for the caliber of wedding we were planning. When I wanted to invite my college roommates, he pointed out that his colleagues and clients would be attending, and we needed to maintain a certain level of professionalism. Slowly, so gradually, I barely noticed. My preferences became suggestions that were politely considered and ultimately dismissed. Marcus wasn't mean about it. He never raised his voice or made demands. He just had this way of explaining why his ideas were better, more practical, more appropriate for the kind of life we were building together. He painted pictures of our future that sounded golden: professional success and social standing, and a beautiful home filled with the kind of sophisticated entertaining I'd only seen in magazines. I wanted to be the woman who could live that life, so I learned to agree, to trust his judgment, to believe that his vision for us was better than anything I could imagine for myself. The wedding was everything Marcus wanted it to be. The country club venue, the designer dress that made me feel like I was wearing a costume, the photographer who captured images that looked perfect but somehow didn't feel like me. I stood at the altar looking at this handsome, successful man who'd chosen me, surrounded by flowers I hadn't picked, and wearing a dress I hadn't loved, promising to love and honor someone I was still trying to understand. In the photos I'm smiling, but if you look closely, my eyes seem uncertain, like I'm asking a question I don't know how to voice. After the honeymoon in Paris, a trip that felt more like a performance than a celebration, we moved into Marcus's house in the suburbs. It was beautiful, everything decorated in neutrals and clean lines that belonged in a magazine. The kitchen had granite countertops and stainless steel appliances I didn't know how to use. The living room had white furniture that made me afraid to sit down, afraid to touch anything, afraid to exist in the space without leaving a mark. Marcus loved that house, loved showing it off to visitors, loved the way it reflected his success and good taste. I felt like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. He encouraged me to quit the flower shop. "Why work for someone else when you don't need to?" he'd say. "You could volunteer, take art classes, learn to be a proper wife to someone in my position." The phrase proper wife sent chills through me, but I couldn't articulate why. I loved working, loved the creativity and the customer connections and the satisfaction of building something beautiful with my hands. But Marcus painted pictures of lazy mornings and long lunches and the freedom to pursue hobbies instead of obligations. He made it sound like a gift, like liberation from the mundane world of commerce and responsibility. So I gave my notice at Petals and Posies, hugging Mrs. Henderson goodbye, and promising to visit often. She held my hands at the door, and looked into my eyes with an expression I couldn't read. "You call me if you need anything," she said. "Anything at all, you hear me." I thought it was an odd thing to say at the time. Why would I need anything? I was married to a successful man who loved me, living in a beautiful house with no financial worries. What could I possibly need? The first months of marriage felt like an extended audition for a role I hadn't studied for. Marcus had expectations I hadn't known existed. Dinner should be ready when he got home from work, even though I'd never been much of a cook. The house should be spotless, even though I'd lived my whole life in comfortable chaos. I should dress appropriately for the wife of someone in his position, even though I'd always preferred jeans and sweaters to the pencil skirts and blazers he bought for me. He never said these things directly. Instead, he'd make gentle suggestions, helpful observations about how I could improve, kind corrections that felt like paper cuts. When I burned dinner, or forgot to dust, or wore the wrong outfit to one of his work functions, Marcus would get this look. Not angry, exactly, but disappointed. Puzzled, like he was trying to figure out how he'd misjudged me so badly. He'd sigh and shake his head, sometimes make a joke about how he'd married a wild woman who needed domesticating. His friends would laugh, and I'd smile along, but inside I felt smaller each time, like I was shrinking away from myself piece by piece. I started trying harder, reading cooking magazines and cleaning tutorials and fashion blogs. I made lists and schedules and tried to become the woman Marcus had married, or maybe the woman he'd thought he was marrying. But no matter how hard I tried, I always seemed to fall short. The house was never quite clean enough, the dinner never quite right, my clothes never quite appropriate. Marcus was patient with my failures, understanding about my shortcomings, always ready with advice about how I could do better next time. The isolation crept in so slowly, I didn't notice it happening. Marcus didn't forbid me from seeing friends or family, he just had observations about them. My college friends were immature, stuck in the past instead of growing up like I had. My sister was jealous of my success and trying to cause problems in my marriage. My parents were wonderful people, but they didn't understand the pressures of the kind of life Marcus and I were building together. He never said I couldn't see them, he just made it clear that my relationships with them reflected poorly on us as a couple, that a mature woman would naturally outgrow these childhood connections. Gradually, I stopped making plans with people who seemed to cause Marcus stress. I declined invitations and made excuses until the invitations stopped coming. I told myself it was natural, that married people had different priorities, that I was simply evolving into a more sophisticated version of myself. When my sister called to check on me, I found myself editing my stories, leaving out the parts that might sound concerning, emphasizing how happy and fortunate I was. When my mother asked if everything was all right, I laughed and told her I was just busy being a newlywed. The criticism became more frequent and more specific. Marcus had opinions about my hair, my makeup, my posture, the way I laughed too loudly at parties, or talked too much about topics that didn't interest other people. He had suggestions for how I could be more elegant, more refined, more worthy of the life he was providing for me. These weren't cruel criticisms, they were loving guidance from a husband who wanted his wife to shine. At least that's how he presented them, and that's how I tried to receive them. I started second-guessing everything. Was my voice really too loud? Did I really interrupt people when they were talking? Were my stories actually boring? Marcus was so much more socially successful than I was, so much more sophisticated and worldly. It made sense that he would notice things I couldn't see about myself, that he would want to help me become better. I tried to be grateful for his guidance, even when it felt like criticism, even when it made me feel stupid and inadequate and wrong. The first time Marcus raised his voice at me, I was so shocked I didn't know how to respond. I'd been telling a story at one of his work dinners, something silly about a customer at the flower shop, when he cut me off mid-sentence. "Jessica," he said, his tone sharp enough to slice through the conversation around us. "I think everyone's heard enough about your little flower shop adventures. Maybe let someone else talk for a while." The table went quiet for a moment before someone else jumped in with a different topic, but I sat there burning with embarrassment, feeling like a child who'd been scolded for speaking out of turn.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later at home, Marcus apologized. He'd been stressed at work, he said. I'd been dominating the conversation, and he'd just been trying to help me save face. He pulled me close and stroked my hair and told me he loved me, that he just wanted me to succeed in these social situations. I forgave him because I wanted to believe his explanation, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. But something had shifted, some fundamental understanding about the balance of power in our relationship. I'd felt his capacity for public humiliation, and the knowledge of it lived in my chest like a small cold stone. After that, I was more careful. I spoke less at social gatherings, smiled more, let Marcus lead conversations while I played the role of supportive wife. I got compliments on how poised I was, how well suited to Marcus, how lucky he was to have found such a perfect partner. These compliments should have felt good, but instead they felt hollow, like people were praising me for successfully erasing myself. I missed the woman who used to laugh too loudly and tell rambling stories and take up space without apologizing for it. But that woman seemed inappropriate for the life I was living now, too big and too much for the space I was supposed to occupy. The fights started small and grew larger. Marcus would come home stressed from work and find fault with everything I'd done during the day. The house wasn't clean enough, dinner wasn't ready on time, I'd spent too much money at the grocery store, or bought the wrong brand of something he'd specifically requested. His complaints felt reasonable at first. He worked hard to provide for us, so it wasn't too much to ask that I manage the household efficiently in return. But nothing I did ever seemed good enough, and the goalposts kept moving in ways I couldn't predict or understand. Marcus never hit me. I want to be clear about that because it took me years to understand that abuse doesn't always leave visible bruises. Instead, he had this way of making me feel stupid with just a look, worthless with just a tone of voice. He'd sigh when I asked questions, roll his eyes when I shared opinions, shake his head when I tried to contribute to conversations about topics he considered above my understanding. He made me feel like a burden he was too kind to abandon, a charity case he was too generous to give up on.
When I suggested going back to work, maybe starting my own floral design business, Marcus was gently discouraging. The market was saturated, he explained. I didn't have the business experience to compete with established companies. Besides, what would people think if his wife had to work? It would reflect poorly on his ability to provide for his family. He painted my desire for independence as a criticism of his success, a sign that I didn't appreciate everything he'd given me. I let the dream go because fighting for it felt selfish and ungrateful. I started therapy during the second year of our marriage, desperate to understand why I felt so lost and unhappy in a life that looked perfect from the outside. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was kind and patient, and in her office I tried to explain the feeling that I was disappearing inside my own life. I told her about Marcus's helpful suggestions and loving corrections, about how grateful I should feel and how guilty I felt for not feeling grateful enough. Dr. Mitchell listened carefully and asked gentle questions that made me think about things I'd been avoiding. "Do you feel like you can be yourself in your marriage?" she asked one day. The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I couldn't remember who myself was anymore. I'd become so focused on being the woman Marcus needed me to be that I'd lost track of the woman I actually was. In that sterile office with its soft lighting and comfortable chairs, I started to cry for the first time in months. I cried for the flower shop I'd given up, for the friends I'd lost touch with, for the dreams I'd abandoned, for the version of myself that used to exist before I learned to apologize for taking up space. Mitchell helped me see patterns I'd been blind to, helped me understand that love shouldn't require me to shrink myself to make room for someone else's ego. She gave me books about healthy relationships and emotional abuse, resources I read in secret like contraband. The words on those pages described my life with such accuracy it was frightening. The isolation, the criticism disguised as caring, the way Marcus made me doubt my own perceptions and feelings. I wasn't crazy or ungrateful or difficult. I was being systematically diminished by someone who claimed to love me. The revelation should have been liberating, but instead it was terrifying. If I wasn't the problem, if Marcus was really emotionally abusive, then what was I supposed to do with that information? I was married to this man. I'd built my entire life around him. I had no job, no independent income, no social support system outside of his circle. The idea of leaving felt impossible, like jumping off a cliff with no certainty that there would be anything to catch me at the bottom. I started making small changes, testing the boundaries of my own autonomy. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something just for me that had nothing to do with being Marcus's wife. I reconnected with my sister through text messages, careful conversations that didn't reveal too much, but helped me remember that there was a world outside my marriage. I opened my own bank account with money I saved from the household budget, small amounts that Marcus wouldn't notice missing. These tiny acts of independence felt both thrilling and terrifying, like learning to walk again after a long illness. Marcus noticed the changes and didn't like them. My pottery class was a waste of time and money. My sister was a bad influence who was trying to cause problems in our marriage. My new habit of taking long walks by myself was antisocial and concerning. He didn't forbid these activities outright, but he made his disapproval clear through sighs and eye rolls, and passive-aggressive comments about how I was pulling away from him, how I was becoming selfish and difficult, how marriage was supposed to be about partnership and compromise. The compromise always seemed to go in one direction. When Marcus wanted something, it was reasonable and necessary, and I was selfish for resisting. When I wanted something, it was frivolous and expensive and a sign that I didn't appreciate what I already had. The mathematical inequality of our relationship became impossible to ignore once I started looking for it. I gave and gave and gave, while Marcus took and took and took, and somehow I was always the one falling short, always the one who needed to try harder, always the one who was failing to live up to my obligations as a wife. I started documenting things, not consciously at first, just keeping a journal where I wrote down conversations and incidents that bothered me. Dr. Mitchell had suggested journaling as a way to process my feelings, but it became something more than that. It became a record of reality that I could refer back to when Marcus tried to convince me that things had happened differently than I remembered. The gaslighting was subtle but constant. He'd deny saying things I clearly remembered him saying, reframe arguments to make me the aggressor, claim I was being too sensitive or taking things out of context. But my journal didn't lie. My journal held the truth when my own memory felt unreliable. Reading back through those entries was like watching my own slow-motion drowning. Page after page of confusion and self-doubt, of trying to understand why I felt so unhappy in a life that should have made me grateful. I could see the pattern of Marcus's control tactics spelled out in my own handwriting, could trace the way he'd systematically isolated me from everything that made me feel strong and confident and whole. The woman who wrote those early entries felt like a stranger, someone I barely recognized, someone who'd been so thoroughly convinced of her own inadequacy that she'd accepted abuse as love. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd spent the day at my pottery class and felt happy for the first time in weeks. I'd finished a vase I was particularly proud of, had laughed with the other students, had felt like myself in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. I came home humming, still covered in clay dust, carrying my creation carefully in both hands. Marcus was waiting in the living room, his face dark with an anger I'd never seen before. "Where the hell have you been?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. I told him about pottery class, confused by his tone. He knew where I went on Tuesdays. We'd had this conversation before. Marcus stood up slowly, deliberately, and I instinctively took a step backward. "You were supposed to be here when I got home," he said. "I had clients coming for dinner, and you weren't here to help. The house is a mess and you're off playing in the dirt like a child." I tried to explain that he'd never mentioned dinner plans, that I would have been there if I'd known, but Marcus wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in punishment. "You're becoming selfish, Jessica," he said, his voice getting louder. "Ever since you started this therapy nonsense and these ridiculous classes, you've forgotten your responsibilities. You've forgotten who pays for this house and this life and these little hobbies of yours. I work my ass off to give you everything, and you can't even be bothered to be here when I need you." The vase was still in my hands, this beautiful thing I'd created with my own skill and imagination, and Marcus looked at it with disgust. "This is what's more important than your marriage?" he asked. "This piece of garbage." Before I could react, he grabbed the vase from my hands and threw it against the wall. It shattered into dozens of pieces, clay fragments scattering across the hardwood floor, like evidence of something precious that could never be put back together. I stared at the broken pottery and felt something break inside me too. Not my spirit, exactly, but my willingness to keep pretending that this was normal, that this was love, that I deserved to be treated like this. The vase had been mine, something I'd made with my own hands, something that belonged to me in a way that nothing else in that house did. And Marcus had destroyed it without hesitation, without remorse, like it was nothing more than an obstacle to his authority. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I sat on the bathroom floor and made a decision. I was going to leave. I didn't know how or when or where I would go, but I was going to get out of this marriage before it killed whatever was left of the woman I used to be. I looked at myself in the mirror, and barely recognized the face staring back at me. I looked older, sadder, smaller than the confident woman who'd run a flower shop and dreamed of bigger things. But somewhere behind the fear and exhaustion, I could still see traces of Jessica Thompson, the woman who'd existed before Marcus Williams taught her to apologize for breathing too loudly. The planning took months. I had to be careful, strategic and visible in my preparations. I started researching divorce lawyers and domestic violence resources. I opened a secret email account and used the library computers to avoid leaving a digital trail on my home laptop. I began saving money more aggressively, skimming cash from grocery shopping and household expenses, hiding it in a safety deposit box. Marcus didn't know about. I researched apartments and jobs and tried to figure out how to rebuild a life I'd dismantled so completely. Dr. Mitchell helped me create a safety plan. We talked about the signs that Marcus might become physically dangerous, about how to leave safely when the time was right. She connected me with other women who'd escaped similar situations, women who'd rebuilt their lives from nothing and found happiness on the other side of terror. These conversations gave me hope and courage, reminded me that there was a world beyond Marcus's control where I could exist without permission. I started reconnecting with old friends carefully, testing the waters to see if the bridges I'd burned could be rebuilt. My college roommate Sarah was living in Denver and immediately offered her couch if I needed a place to land. My sister drove down from Omaha one weekend when Marcus was out of town, and we talked for hours about everything I'd been hiding for years.
She cried when she realized how bad things had gotten, angry at herself for not pushing harder when I'd started pulling away. But there was no time for regret. There was only the future and the question of how to get there safely. The opportunity came in June. Marcus was going to a week-long conference in Chicago, one of his biggest professional events of the year. He'd be gone for 7 days, completely focused on work and networking, and all the things that mattered more to him than our marriage. I told him I was planning to visit my sister while he was away, maybe do some shopping and relaxing. He barely listened to my explanation, already mentally in Chicago with his colleagues and clients. The lack of attention that had hurt me so many times became a gift, his indifference creating the space I needed to disappear. I'd been practicing for months, going through the motions of packing and leaving and starting over. I knew exactly what I would take and what I would leave behind. The important things weren't the expensive jewelry or designer clothes Marcus had bought me, they were the photo albums from my childhood, the few pieces of my grandmother's china I'd managed to hold on to, the business plan I'd been secretly developing for my own floral design company. These things fit easily into 2 suitcases and a small box, everything that really belonged to me condensed into a space that could fit in the trunk of my car. The morning Marcus left for his conference, he kissed me goodbye with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown me for months. "Have a good time with your sister," he said, already checking his phone for messages. "Try not to let her fill your head with any crazy ideas." The irony wasn't lost on me. The crazy idea was already fully formed, carefully planned, ready to execute. The crazy idea was that I deserved better than this, that I could survive without him, that somewhere out there was a life where I could be myself without apology. I waited until his plane was in the air before I started moving. I called in sick to the volunteer work I'd been doing at the hospital, canceled my upcoming appointments, made sure there would be no immediate reason for anyone to look for me. Then I went through the house methodically, taking only what was legally and morally mine, leaving behind everything that belonged to the life Marcus had created for us. I packed my car like I was loading for a camping trip, efficient and practical and focused on the essentials. The letter I left was brief and direct. I didn't owe him explanations or apologies or detailed justifications for my decision. I simply told him that I was leaving, that I would be filing for divorce, and that he should contact me only through my lawyer. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to the note, a small circle of gold that had once symbolized forever, but had become a shackle I no longer wanted to wear. Walking away from that house felt like walking out of a prison I'd built around myself, one compromise at a time. The drive to Denver was the longest 8 hours of my life. Every mile felt like both an escape and a leap into the unknown. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Marcus's BMW behind me, half convinced he would somehow know what I'd done and come after me. But the highway stretched out ahead of me like a promise, and with each passing hour I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt free. Sarah's apartment in Denver was everything Marcus's house wasn't. Cluttered with books and art supplies, plants spilling from every windowsill, mismatched furniture that invited you to curl up and stay a while. The walls were covered with photographs from her travels, bright splashes of color that made the space feel alive and vibrant. When she opened the door that evening and saw me standing there with my suitcases, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough for me to start believing I might actually be safe. The first week felt like hiding in a cave, waiting for the storm to pass. Marcus called my phone constantly, leaving voicemails that cycled through confusion, anger, and promises to change. When I finally listened to them, his voice sounded different than I remembered, smaller somehow, less commanding now that I wasn't standing in front of him. He'd found my note when he returned from Chicago, and the messages revealed a man who genuinely couldn't understand how his perfectly controlled world had fallen apart. "Jessica, you're being ridiculous," he said in one message. "Whatever's bothering you, we can work it out. You can't just run away from your problems like a child." In another, his tone shifted to wounded confusion. "I've given you everything, a beautiful home, financial security, a good life.
How can you throw all of that away? The final messages were threats disguised as concern. You're not thinking clearly. You need help. When you come to your senses, I'll be here, but I won't wait forever. I changed my phone number after the first week. There was something liberating about cutting that last electronic cord, about knowing that Marcus could no longer reach me whenever he wanted to remind me of my failures. Sarah helped me set up a new email address, new social media accounts, new everything. It felt like being reborn, like shedding an old skin that had never quite fit right anyway. Finding work was harder than I'd expected. My resume had a gap the size of a canyon where the last 2 years should have been. How do you explain to potential employers that you've been a housewife to a man who slowly convinced you that you were incapable of anything more challenging than arranging flowers and keeping house? The flower shops I applied to in Denver were polite but distant. They needed experienced designers, not someone who'd been out of the industry for years and had no local connections or portfolio to show. I took a job at a coffee shop near Sarah's apartment, something that would pay my share of rent and groceries while I figured out my next move. The work was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. My hands soft from 2 years of avoiding anything that might damage my manicure, blistered from the constant washing and steaming and grinding. I made mistakes with orders, burned milk, spilled things, apologized constantly to customers who seemed annoyed by my inexperience. But there was something healing about the physicality of it, about learning to do things with my hands again, about earning money that belonged entirely to me. The other employees were mostly college students and aspiring artists, people with dreams bigger than their current circumstances. They talked about auditions and gallery openings and startup ideas while we cleaned tables and restocked supplies. Their optimism was infectious, their assumption that current struggles were temporary stepping stones rather than permanent failures. Being around them reminded me that I was still young enough to start over, still capable of becoming something other than what I'd been. My coworker Lisa was a photography student who'd been working at the coffee shop for 3 years, saving money for better equipment and art school applications. She had this way of seeing beauty in ordinary moments, pulling out her camera to capture the way afternoon light fell across the shop floor, or the expression on a customer's face as they tasted their first sip of coffee. She offered to take some professional headshots for me, pictures I could use for job applications or business profiles. The woman in those photographs looked like someone I was still learning to recognize, confident and approachable in ways I'd forgotten I could be. Marcus found me after 6 weeks. I was walking home from work when I saw his BMW parked outside Sarah's building, and my heart started racing like I was being chased by something dangerous. He was sitting on the steps leading to the front door, looking every inch the successful businessman in his expensive suit, but there was something desperate in his posture that made him seem smaller than I remembered. When he saw me approaching, he stood up with that smile I'd once found charming, the one that made him seem like he was genuinely happy to see you. "Jessica," he said, spreading his arms like he expected me to run into them. "Thank God you're okay. I've been worried sick. You look tired, honey. This whole thing has been hard on both of us. I knew if I could just see you face to face, we could work this out." His voice was gentle, reasonable, the tone he used when he was trying to convince me that his perspective was the only logical one. But standing there on the sidewalk with distance between us, I could see the manipulation more clearly than I ever had before. I told him to leave, that I'd meant what I said in my letter, that there was nothing to work out. Marcus's expression shifted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the anger underneath. "You're making a mistake, Jessica," he said, his voice getting harder. "Look at yourself. You're working in a coffee shop, living on someone's couch, throwing your life away for what? Some misguided idea about independence. You need me more than you want to admit." The old me would have listened to that voice, would have heard the logic in his arguments and started doubting my own judgment. But the woman who'd been earning her own money and making her own decisions for 6 weeks wasn't the same person who'd left Nebraska in tears. I told him again to leave, and when he took a step toward me, I pulled out my phone and threatened to call the police. Something in my voice must have convinced him I was serious because he backed down, but not before delivering one final prediction. "You'll be back, Jessica," he said, his confidence returning, as he straightened his tie and prepared to leave. You always come back. You can't survive without me." The words hit me like a slap, not because they hurt, but because they revealed how little he actually knew about who I was or what I was capable of. He drove away in his BMW, probably convinced that he'd planted seeds of doubt that would eventually drive me back to him. Instead, he'd given me something more valuable than he could have imagined. He'd given me a challenge. I started seeing Dr. Rachel Chen, a therapist Sarah recommended who specialized in helping women recover from abusive relationships. Dr. Chen was nothing like Dr. Mitchell back home, where Dr. Mitchell had been gentle and careful. Dr. Chen was direct and challenging in ways that pushed me to see my situation more clearly. She didn't let me minimize Marcus's behavior, or make excuses for staying as long as I had. She helped me understand that healing wasn't just about leaving an abusive situation, it was about rebuilding a sense of self that had been systematically dismantled. The nightmares started around this time, vivid dreams where I was back in Marcus's house, trapped and unable to find the door. I'd wake up in Sarah's spare room gasping, temporarily confused about where I was and whether I was actually safe. Dr. Chen said this was normal, that my nervous system was still processing years of chronic stress and hypervigilance. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques, ways to remind my body that the danger was over, that I was in control of my own life now. I started taking business classes at the community college, using the money I'd saved from the coffee shop to invest in my future. Marketing, accounting, business law, all the practical skills I'd need to start my own company someday. The coursework was challenging in ways that made me remember how much I'd enjoyed learning when I was younger, before Marcus convinced me that my intelligence was limited and my opinions were rarely worth expressing. My professors treated me like an adult capable of complex thought, and slowly I started believing them. The idea for Mountain Bloom Designs came to me during a particularly difficult therapy session. Chen had been pushing me to think about what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years, not what I thought was realistic or practical, but what would make me genuinely happy. I found myself talking about flowers, about the way creating beautiful arrangements had always felt like a form of meditation, about how I dreamed of having my own business before Marcus convinced me it was impossible. "Why is it impossible?" Dr. Chen asked. I gave her all the reasons Marcus had provided, all the logical arguments about market saturation and business experience and financial risk.
She listened patiently, and then asked the question that changed everything. "Whose voice am I hearing right now, Jessica? Yours or his?" The realization hit me like cold water. Even months after leaving, I was still carrying Marcus's voice in my head, still letting his limitations define my possibilities. I started researching the Denver floral market during my breaks at the coffee shop, studying successful businesses and identifying gaps I might be able to fill. There were plenty of traditional florists, but fewer that specialized in sustainable, locally sourced arrangements. Even fewer that offered the kind of personalized design services I'd dreamed of providing. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that there was space for something new, something that reflected my values and artistic vision, rather than someone else's idea of what a flower shop should be. Sarah became my first business partner, not officially but in spirit. She offered to help with photography and social media marketing in exchange for creative collaboration on projects. We spent evenings in her apartment planning and dreaming, sketching logo ideas, and discussing target markets and pricing strategies. Having someone believe in my vision as much as I was learning to believe in it myself made the whole enterprise feel more real, more possible. I started freelancing on weekends, taking small jobs for friends of Sarah's who needed arrangements for parties or events. Nothing fancy at first, just centerpieces for dinner parties and bouquets for amateur photographers, but each project helped me rebuild my confidence and develop my skills. I experimented with unconventional materials, incorporating succulents and herbs and wildflowers in ways that made traditional arrangements feel fresh and modern. My style was evolving, becoming something uniquely mine rather than a copy of what I'd learned working for someone else. The divorce proceedings moved slowly, complicated by Marcus's refusal to accept that I was serious about ending our marriage. He contested everything, from property division to spousal support, forcing me to hire a lawyer I could barely afford and extend the process far longer than necessary.
His attorney sent letter after letter, trying to convince me to return to mediation, to consider reconciliation, to think about the financial security I was giving up by insisting on this divorce. But I wasn't the same woman who'd married Marcus, and I wasn't interested in the kind of security that came at the cost of my autonomy. I'd rather struggle financially as myself than live comfortably as someone else's idea of who I should be. My lawyer, Patricia Santos, understood this in ways that made me grateful I'd found her. She'd built her practice helping women escape difficult marriages, and she knew how to protect my interests while keeping Marcus at a safe distance. The settlement, when it finally came through, was smaller than I'd hoped, but larger than I'd feared. Marcus kept the house and most of the investments, but I walked away with enough money to start over properly, to rent my own apartment and launch my business without depending on anyone else's support. The day the papers were signed felt like graduation from a program I'd never wanted to attend, certification that I was officially free to become whoever I wanted to be. I found a small studio apartment in a neighborhood full of artists and entrepreneurs, the kind of place where creativity was valued more than conformity. The space was tiny compared to Marcus's house, but it was mine in ways that mansion had never been. I painted the walls bright colors, hung Sarah's photographs alongside my own artwork, filled the windowsills with plants that thrived in the Colorado sunshine. For the first time in years, my living space reflected my personality rather than someone else's vision of sophistication. Mountain Bloom Designs officially launched on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd left Marcus. I'd rented a small commercial space in an up-and-coming part of downtown, nothing fancy but bright and welcoming with big windows that let in plenty of natural light. Sarah documented the opening day, capturing my nervous excitement as I unlocked the door for the first time as a business owner. The photographs she took that day show a woman who looks confident and purposeful, someone who belongs exactly where she is. The first few months were harder than I'd expected. Building a client base from scratch meant long days and longer nights, marketing myself constantly, and taking on jobs that barely covered expenses just to establish a reputation. I made mistakes, overcommitted to projects I wasn't ready for, struggled with the business side of entrepreneurship in ways my community college classes hadn't fully prepared me for. But every challenge felt manageable because I was facing it as myself, making decisions based on my own judgment rather than someone else's expectations. My breakthrough came through an unexpected connection. Lisa, my former coworker from the coffee shop, had been commissioned to photograph a high-profile wedding for a tech executive and his fiancée. The couple had specific ideas about incorporating sustainable, locally sourced elements into their celebration, and the traditional florists they'd consulted hadn't understood their vision. Lisa recommended me, and suddenly I found myself pitching to clients who had the budget and influence to transform my business overnight. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of creating, an outdoor ceremony in the mountains with arrangements that looked like they'd grown naturally from the landscape. I used wild flowers and native plants, wooden containers I'd crafted myself, design elements that celebrated the natural beauty of Colorado rather than trying to impose something artificial onto it. The photographs from that wedding, when they appeared in local magazines and wedding blogs, established my reputation as someone who could create something truly special. Word spread through Denver's professional networks faster than I'd imagined possible. Suddenly I was booking corporate events and private parties, designing installations for restaurants and retail spaces, teaching workshops for other aspiring entrepreneurs. The business grew beyond what I could handle alone, and I hired my first employee, then my second, then my third. Each new addition to the team felt like evidence that I was building something real and sustainable, something that could support not just my own dreams, but other people's livelihoods as well. Marcus called me exactly once during this period, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer when I saw his number on my phone, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain than I remembered. He'd heard about my business through mutual acquaintances, he said, and wanted to congratulate me on my success. The conversation was awkward and brief, full of long pauses and careful politeness. He asked if I was happy, and I realized the question surprised me not because I didn't know the answer, but because it had been so long since anyone had asked. Yes, I told him, I was happy. Genuinely completely happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible. There was another long pause, and then Marcus said something that might have been an apology, or might have been an explanation. I'm glad you found what you were looking for, he said. I hope I didn't make it too hard for you to get there. After we hung up, I sat in my office, surrounded by order forms and design sketches, employee schedules and vendor contracts, all the evidence of the life I'd built from nothing. I thought about the woman who'd left Nebraska with 2 suitcases and a heart full of terror, who'd been so convinced of her own inadequacy that she'd accepted emotional abuse as love. That woman felt like someone I'd known long ago, someone I could remember with compassion but no longer recognized as myself. The call from the real estate agent came on a Thursday afternoon in late spring. I'd been looking at houses for months, dreaming of a place where I could live and work, where Mountain Bloom Designs could expand into event planning and workshop spaces. The property she described sounded almost too good to be true, a renovated warehouse in an emerging arts district with living space upstairs and commercial space below, huge windows and exposed brick, and all the character I'd been hoping to find. The asking price was more than I'd planned to spend, but my accountant assured me the numbers worked. My business was profitable enough to support a mortgage, and the investment would pay for itself through expanded services and rental income from part of the commercial space. Standing in that empty warehouse with afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, I could see exactly how to transform it into something magical. A place where people could come, not just to buy flowers, but to learn about design and sustainability, and the joy of creating something beautiful with their own hands. The paperwork took weeks to finalize, complicated by my lack of credit history as an independent person and the usual challenges of commercial real estate transactions. But every obstacle felt surmountable, because I was working towards something I genuinely wanted, something that reflected my vision, rather than someone else's expectations. The day I signed the final documents, Patricia Santos shook my hand and smiled. You've come a long way from that scared woman who walked into my office 2 years ago, she said. I barely recognize you. The renovation took most of the summer, but by September I was ready to host the grand opening of Mountain Bloom Designs' new location. The space was everything I'd envisioned, bright and welcoming, with areas for workshops and consultations, a showroom that felt more like an art gallery than a traditional flower shop. Sarah had documented the entire transformation, creating a time-lapse video that showed the empty warehouse evolving into something beautiful and purposeful. The party was bigger than I'd expected, filled with clients and friends and business contacts who'd become genuine supporters of my vision. I stood in the center of it all wearing a dress I'd chosen because I loved it, not because anyone else would approve of it, watching people enjoy a space I'd created through my own hard work and determination. Lisa was there with her camera, capturing moments I'd want to remember forever. Sarah was there with her boyfriend, proud as if she'd built the business herself. Even Dr. Chen had come, smiling as she watched me navigate the crowd with confidence and grace. Near the end of the evening, as I was saying goodbye to the last guests, I realized something that made me laugh out loud. I was standing in my own building, surrounded by a business I'd built from nothing, holding keys that represented everything Marcus had told me I'd never be capable of achieving. The woman who'd left Nebraska convinced she couldn't survive without him, had not only survived but thrived in ways that would have been impossible if she'd stayed. I thought about Marcus's prediction that I'd come back, his certainty that I couldn't make it on my own. The prediction had become a challenge that drove me forward every time I wanted to give up, every time the work felt too hard or the obstacles too large. His lack of faith in my capabilities had become the fuel for proving him wrong, and the life I'd built was more satisfying than anything I could have achieved with his approval or support. The keys to my building were heavy in my hand, substantial in ways that went far beyond their physical weight. They represented freedom and independence, and the right to exist as myself without asking permission from anyone. They represented every risk I'd taken, and every obstacle I'd overcome, and every moment when I'd chosen to believe in my own potential, rather than someone else's limitations. As I locked the door behind me and walked out into the Denver night, I knew Marcus would never see these keys, would never understand what they represented, would never know the woman I'd become, after I stopped trying to be the woman he wanted me to be. The morning I got the call about the magazine feature, I was in the greenhouse behind my building, hands deep in soil, preparing arrangements for a corporate retreat. My phone buzzed against the potting bench, and I almost ignored it until I saw the area code. New York. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, introducing herself as Elena Rodriguez from Metropolitan Living magazine. They wanted to feature Mountain Bloom designs in their upcoming issue about innovative small businesses transforming urban landscapes. The photo shoot happened 3 weeks later, a whirlwind day that transformed my space into something that belonged in a glossy magazine. Professional photographers arranged lights and adjusted angles while I tried to act natural in my own building. They captured me working with clients, teaching a workshop, standing in my showroom, surrounded by arrangements that represented years of artistic evolution. When the magazine hit stands 2 months later, seeing my face on those pages felt surreal, like looking at someone else's life that had somehow become mine. The publicity changed everything. Orders started coming in from across the country, people who'd seen the article and wanted Mountain Bloom designs for their own events. I hired a logistics coordinator to handle shipping and expanded our online presence to accommodate customers who'd never set foot in Colorado but loved what we represented. The business was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible, and with it came opportunities I'd never dared to dream about. The invitation to speak at the National Small Business Conference arrived on a Tuesday that had already been overwhelming. Between client consultations and staff meetings and vendor calls, I barely had time to process what the email was asking. They wanted me to deliver a keynote address about building a sustainable business from the ground up, sharing my story with an audience of entrepreneurs and industry leaders from around the country. The speaking fee they offered was more than I'd made in my first 6 months of operation. Standing on that stage in Chicago, looking out at an audience of successful business owners and industry professionals, I thought about the woman who'd been too intimidated to speak up at Marcus's dinner parties. The transformation felt impossible and inevitable at the same time, like I'd been moving toward this moment without realizing it. My presentation focused on the practical aspects of building a sustainable business, but the questions afterward revealed that people were more interested in the personal journey, the story of starting over after leaving everything behind. After my talk, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Maria Santos, a marketing executive from Phoenix who'd been planning her own escape from an abusive marriage for months. "Your story gave me hope," she said, gripping my hand like it was a lifeline. "If you can build all this after starting with nothing, maybe I can too." We exchanged contact information, and over the following months, I found myself becoming an informal mentor to women who were facing the same crossroads I'd navigated years earlier. The mentoring started accidentally, but grew into something intentional. I began hosting monthly workshops that combined business skills with personal development, teaching women not just how to arrange flowers, but how to believe in their own capabilities, how to trust their instincts, how to build lives that reflected their values rather than someone else's expectations. The workshops filled up immediately, and the waiting list grew longer each month. These women came from all backgrounds and circumstances, but they shared a hunger for independence and authenticity that I recognized completely. One evening, as I was closing the shop after a particularly successful workshop, my phone rang with a call that would change everything again. The voice was familiar but unexpected, my former neighbor from Nebraska, Mrs. Patterson. She'd gotten my number from my sister and had been following my success through social media and magazine articles. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice urgent in a way that made my stomach clench. "It's about Marcus." Marcus had remarried, she told me, to a woman named Caroline, who seemed lovely but had started showing up to neighborhood gatherings with suspicious bruises and increasingly elaborate excuses for Marcus's controlling behavior. Mrs. Patterson had tried to reach out to Caroline, but Marcus had quickly isolated her from former friends and neighbors, just as he'd done with me. The pattern was repeating itself with someone new, and Mrs. Patterson felt responsible for not speaking up sooner about what she'd witnessed during my marriage. The news hit me harder than I'd expected. Part of me had hoped that therapy and consequences had changed Marcus, that losing me had taught him something about respect and partnership. Learning that he was hurting someone else brought back memories I'd worked hard to process and move beyond. But it also crystallized something important. My story wasn't just about my own healing anymore. It was about preventing other women from enduring what I'd survived. I started working with domestic violence organizations, sharing my experience at fundraising events and support groups. The speaking engagements multiplied, taking me to conferences and shelters and universities across the country. Each time I told my story, women would approach me afterward with their own experiences, their own fears, their own dreams of escape and independence. The common thread was always the same. They'd been convinced they were incapable of surviving alone, but seeing my success gave them permission to imagine a different future. The book deal came through a literary agent who'd heard me speak at a women's leadership conference in Seattle. She believed my story could reach an even wider audience in written form, combining memoir with practical advice for women seeking to rebuild their lives after abuse. Writing the book was harder than starting the business had been, requiring me to revisit painful memories I'd preferred to keep buried. But the process was also healing, allowing me to see my journey with the clarity that only comes from distance and perspective. While I was working on the manuscript, Mountain Bloom Designs continued to expand. We opened a second location in Boulder, then a third in Fort Collins. Each new shop reflected the same principles of sustainability and artistic excellence, but they also reflected the growth of my vision beyond individual arrangements to comprehensive lifestyle design. We offered everything from wedding planning to corporate consulting, workshops to retail products, creating a brand that represented possibility and transformation as much as beautiful flowers. The day I got the call about the television appearance, I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports that showed growth I still couldn't quite believe. The producer from Good Morning America had seen my book proposal and wanted to feature my story during their segment on women entrepreneurs who'd overcome significant obstacles. The interview would be broadcast live to millions of viewers, sharing my message with an audience larger than I'd ever imagined reaching. Sitting in that Manhattan studio at 5 a.m, waiting for my segment to begin, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared woman who'd left Nebraska with 2 suitcases felt like someone from another lifetime, someone I could remember with compassion but barely recognized as myself. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been complete, touching every aspect of who I was and how I moved through the world. The interview itself was brief but powerful. The host asked about the lowest point of my marriage, about the moment I decided to leave, about the challenges of starting over with nothing. But she also asked about the business, about my plans for expansion, about the advice I'd give to other women facing similar situations. The questions allowed me to present myself, not as a victim who'd gotten lucky, but as an entrepreneur who'd built something meaningful through hard work and determination. The response to the television appearance was overwhelming. Orders flooded in from across the country, speaking requests multiplied, and my publisher called to say pre-orders for the book had exceeded all expectations. But the messages that meant the most came from women who said my story had given them courage to leave abusive situations, to pursue business ideas they'd been told were impossible, to believe in their own potential, despite years of being told they were inadequate. Caroline reached out to me 6 months after the television interview, having gotten my contact information from Mrs. Patterson. She'd finally left Marcus after watching my Good Morning America segment, and realizing that her husband's treatment of her wasn't normal or acceptable. She was staying in a shelter in Omaha, working with advocates to plan her next steps, and wanted to thank me for showing her that escape was possible. Her voice on the phone was shaky but determined, and I could hear echoes of my own fear and hope from years earlier. We talked for over an hour that first conversation, and many times afterward as Caroline navigated the legal and emotional challenges of leaving an abusive marriage. I connected her with resources, introduced her to other survivors, offered practical advice about everything from finding housing to rebuilding credit. Watching her transform from a frightened woman, hiding bruises, to a confident person, rebuilding her life, reminded me why sharing my story had become so important. The book launched on a crisp October morning, exactly 5 years after I'd first arrived in Denver. The release party was held at my original shop, the space that had started as a dream and grown into the foundation of everything I'd built afterward. The room was filled with friends and colleagues, clients and mentors, women who'd attended my workshops and journalists who'd covered my story. Sarah photographed the entire evening, capturing moments I'd want to remember forever. Marcus sent a card that day, the first communication I'd received from him since our brief phone conversation years earlier. The message was simple and unsigned: "Congratulations on your success. I always knew you were capable of great things." I read it once and threw it away, recognizing the attempt at revisionist history for what it was. The man who'd told me I'd never survive without him was now trying to claim credit for the success he'd spent years convincing me I'd never achieve. The book tour that followed took me to cities across the country, from small bookstores to major conferences, sharing my story with audiences that ranged from intimate gatherings to packed auditoriums. Each event reinforced the same truth: there were thousands of women living the life I'd escaped, convinced they were trapped by circumstances they couldn't change. Meeting them, talking with them, watching their faces light up as they realized change was possible, had become the most meaningful part of my work. In Portland, a woman named Jennifer told me she'd been planning to go back to her abusive husband until she read my book the night before. In Miami, Maria shared that my story had given her the courage to apply for business loans she'd been told she'd never qualify for. In Dallas, Susan said seeing my success had convinced her daughter to leave a controlling relationship she'd been afraid to escape. These conversations reminded me that personal transformation could create ripples that reached far beyond individual lives. The success brought unexpected challenges. Managing multiple business locations, while writing and speaking and mentoring required skills I was still developing. I hired a business manager, then a personal assistant, then a whole team of people who helped me balance the competing demands of a growing enterprise. Learning to delegate was harder than learning to lead, requiring me to trust other people's judgment in ways that felt vulnerable after years of having my own judgment questioned. The house I eventually bought was nothing like the mansion I'd shared with Marcus. It was smaller but warmer, filled with windows that let in natural light and spaces designed for comfort rather than display. The kitchen was built for cooking and entertaining, with a large island where friends could gather while I prepared meals. The living room had bookshelves filled with volumes I'd chosen myself, artwork from local artists whose vision resonated with mine, furniture that invited conversation and relaxation. But the space I was most proud of was my home office, a bright room overlooking the garden where I did my writing and planning and dreaming. The walls were covered with photographs from my business journey, awards from organizations that recognized my work, letters from women whose lives had been changed by my story. The desk was large enough for spreading out architectural plans and book manuscripts, business proposals and speaking notes, all the evidence of a life lived on my own terms. The garden behind the house became my sanctuary, a space where I could work with soil and plants, and remember where my love of growing things had started. I planted herbs and vegetables alongside flowers, creating arrangements that fed both body and soul. The greenhouse I built there became a laboratory for new design ideas, a place where I could experiment without the pressure of client expectations or business deadlines. On quiet evenings, I'd work in that greenhouse and think about the woman who'd left Nebraska convinced she was incapable of survival alone. The transformation still felt miraculous sometimes, not because it had been easy but because it had been complete. I'd rebuilt not just my circumstances but my entire understanding of what I was capable of achieving. The scared woman who'd accepted emotional abuse as love had become someone who helped other women recognize their own strength and potential. The keynote speech I delivered at the International Women's Leadership Summit 2 years later felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned about resilience and reinvention. Standing before an audience of successful women from around the world, I talked about the difference between surviving and thriving, between escaping difficult circumstances and transforming them into opportunities for growth. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for my story, but for every woman who'd ever had to rebuild her life from nothing. After the conference, I received a message that surprised me more than any recognition or award ever could. It was from Marcus's daughter from his first marriage, a young woman I'd never met but who'd been following my journey through social media and news coverage. She thanked me for speaking openly about her father's behavior, for helping her understand that the treatment she'd witnessed wasn't normal or acceptable. My story had given her language for experiences she'd never been able to articulate, validation for feelings she'd been taught to dismiss. The foundation I established the following year was designed to provide microloans and business mentoring to women leaving abusive relationships. The seed money came from profits from Mountain Bloom Designs and royalties from the book, but the real value came from the network of successful women who'd joined as advisors and mentors. We funded everything from food trucks to consulting practices, beauty salons to tech startups, proving that given opportunity and support, survivors could become entrepreneurs and leaders and innovators. Each success story that came through the foundation felt personal, a reminder of what became possible when women were given permission to believe in their own capabilities. Maria from Phoenix opened a marketing consultancy that specialized in helping small businesses reach Latino customers. Jennifer from Portland launched a nonprofit that provided legal services to domestic violence survivors. Susan's daughter from Dallas started a technology company that created safety apps for women in dangerous situations. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's prediction about my inability to survive alone had become the driving force behind my success. His certainty that I'd come back, that I couldn't make it without him, had challenged me to prove him wrong in ways that exceeded my own expectations. What he'd meant as a threat had become a promise I'd made to myself, a commitment to building a life so fulfilling and successful that the idea of returning to his control would become not just unthinkable but laughable. Standing in my home office late one evening, reviewing applications for foundation grants, I came across one that made me pause. The applicant was Caroline, Marcus's second wife, who'd taken her settlement money and used it to open a counseling practice specializing in trauma recovery. Her business plan was solid, her credentials impressive, her mission statement passionate and clear. Funding her application felt like closing a circle, supporting someone else's transformation with resources I'd gained from my own. The final chapter of my book, which had been the hardest to write, focused on forgiveness. Not forgiveness of Marcus, which remained incomplete and conditional, but forgiveness of myself for staying as long as I had, for accepting treatment that diminished my sense of worth, for taking so long to recognize my own strength. The letters I received from readers often focused on this chapter, women who'd been carrying guilt and shame about their own survival stories, finding permission to be gentler with themselves. The 10-year anniversary of leaving Nebraska arrived without fanfare, just another day in a life that had become rich with purpose and possibility. I marked it privately, sitting in my greenhouse with a cup of coffee and a stack of foundation applications, surrounded by plants I'd grown from seeds and business plans I'd helped develop from dreams. The contrast with where I'd been a decade earlier was so stark it felt like comparing two completely different people's lives. The keys to my building, my house, my car, my safe deposit box, all hung on a ring that represented more than simple ownership. They represented autonomy and independence, and the right to exist without asking permission from anyone. They represented every risk I'd taken, and every obstacle I'd overcome, and every moment when I'd chosen to believe in my own potential, rather than someone else's limitations. Marcus had never seen these keys, would never understand what they represented, would never know the woman I'd become after I stopped trying to be the woman he wanted me to be. The speech I gave at Caroline's counseling practice opening 6 months later felt like passing a torch, sharing wisdom gained from experience with someone just beginning her own journey of professional independence. Looking around the room at her new office, seeing the certificates on her walls and the hope in her eyes, I remembered my own early days of business ownership, the mixture of terror and excitement that came with building something from nothing. You'll have moments when you doubt yourself, I told the gathered crowd of supporters and potential clients. You'll have days when the challenges feel overwhelming and the goals feel impossible. But remember that every successful business, every meaningful life, every important change started with someone deciding they deserved better than what they had. You've already made the hardest decision by choosing to leave a situation that wasn't serving you. Everything else is just details. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Marcus's words one more time. You'll be back, Jessica. You always come back. You can't survive without me. He'd been so certain, so confident in his assessment of my limitations and dependencies. But he'd never seen the steel that his cruelty had forged in my spine, never understood that his attempts to diminish me had actually revealed reserves of strength I hadn't known existed. I never went back, not to him, not to the life he'd designed for me, not to the small version of myself that had accepted his version of reality as truth. Instead, I'd built something he could never have imagined, become someone he'd never believed I could be, created a legacy that would outlast any relationship I'd ever shared with him. The keys in my purse weren't just metal and plastic. They were proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, that the greatest victory is becoming the person you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.